So after World War II, the war resumes between the Kuomintang and the Chinese Communist Party. So the nationalists, communists are at it again. It ends in 1949, and the communists are in control. So the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island of Taiwan, where they established the Republic of China. The Kuomintang started out with more men and more weapons due to their wartime alliances, and they even controlled the cities. Mao had disciplined, experienced guerrilla fighters who were not only able to hide their activities in plain sight, but they used the war as a way to build their base in the countryside. The peasants were organized into agricultural cooperatives, and they organized state-sponsored unions and indoctrinated the youth in Mao Zedong thought. Anyone who deviated from socialist thought was publicly shamed and made to publicly criticize themselves. Now, this is going to get its first test in Korea, all right? Chinese communism gets their first test in the Korean War when they threw their forces into battle against the Americans to defend the North. Economically, the People's Republic of China followed the Soviet example of 5-year plans of heavy industry and collective farming, even sending engineers and state planners to Russia so they could train. The growth of production didn't move fast enough for Mao's tastes, and the slow-moving bureaucracy of the USSR didn't exactly inspire Chairman Mao. Now, he didn't want the fire to go out of the revolution, so he launched what was called the 100 Flowers campaign. He wanted a call for new political ideas, so China's intellectuals openly criticized the Communist Party and Mao. And this was a clear trick. And intellectuals were either killed, imprisoned, or sent to the countryside for what was called re-education. Now, Mao believed that the rightists were gone, but he still divided his Communist Party into Reds and experts. The experts were those who managed collectivization and industrial development and were becoming elitists that were cut off from the people, in Mao's opinion, while the Reds emphasized power of will and could bring about radical change because they were connected to the people. Now, of the other great changes that Mao Zedong is remembered for, there are two. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward as a method of increasing industrial production, which he thought agricultural collectives could be used for. Instead of constructing steel factories, revolutionaries would set up the so-called backyard steel furnaces to catch Great Britain in iron and steel production within a 15-year period of time. 700,000 collectives were reorganized into 26,000 communes, and the masses were directed to pour all of their energy into creating steel out of scrap metal. This massive effort deforested vast swaths of China's forests, and it resulted in the restriction of property rights and even deprived peasants of plots of land that had once been used to feed their families. Birds also were said to be loud and noisy, so they were killed in the cities, which meant more insects to ruin crops in the countryside. Combine that with men being pulled from crop production to mend to the furnaces or, tend to them, and the worthlessness of the output of the furnaces, gives you a recipe for disaster. About 20 to 30 million people died in the resulting famine, and Mao's only criticism of himself was, well, at least they learned to trade. The failure of this experiment led the Communist Party to publicly acknowledge Mao's leadership, but behind the scenes they reduced his responsibilities. The Cultural Revolution was Mao's way of attempting to consolidate power for himself. He began to organize the youth of China into the Red Guard and taught them that Mao was the source of all wisdom. Each member of the Red Guard was given a little red book of Mao's quotations, and this was the equivalent of their Bible. Mao used the Red Guard to attack the experts who had criticized him during the Great Leap Forward. And this soon sent China into chaos, as radical Red Guards openly attacked party offices. They publicly humiliated their teachers, harassed anyone who was educated, and they even destroyed artifacts that linked China with the past. Intellectuals were sent to the countryside for re-education, where many of them died. The country really ground to an economic standstill, so Mao did allow the People's Liberation Army to restore order, while the worst of the Red Guards were themselves re-educated. Now, as China stabilized, Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, tried to seize power as part of her Gang of Four, and Mao's deteriorating health wasn't making life any easier. Mao Zedong died in 1976, and nearly 1 million Chinese attended his funeral service in Tiananmen Square. The service was broadcast and televised throughout the nation. Now, prior to the service, sirens rang out for 3 minutes, and all Chinese were expected to remain completely silent. 80 million people, 1/4 of the world's population, did nothing for 3 minutes. Mao's wife was eventually arrested, proving that Mao was the only reason that his wife had been tolerated. Now, after Mao, the man who eventually emerges is Deng Xiaoping. And he had previously been purged from his leadership position because he was pragmatic. He went against the Great Leap Forward. Mao ended up sending him to work in a tractor factory. He reemerged in the 70s and outmaneuvered not only Jiang Qing, but also Mao's successor. Deng Xiaoping allowed Mao's successor to live because he hoped it would set a precedent, and he set about to modernize China. Now, his first steps towards a more modern China was to grant land to peasants for private cultivation, and food production ended up increasing. Many families could now afford small luxuries, yet many wondered how a lifelong communist could now all of a sudden embrace elements of capitalism. Deng Xiaoping famously replied, "It does not matter whether the cat is black or white, as long as she catches mice." Now, stage 2 of the reforms was to develop the industrial sector of China. So foreign investors were invited to the Guangzhou region near Hong Kong to build manufacturing plants. Many corporations moved in to take advantage of cheap labor. The army became an economic power by controlling shipping lanes. Chinese cities attracted millions of rural immigrants, so they experienced a construction boom, and Shanghai became this new major cosmopolitan center. Manufacturing spread into the eastern and central areas of China, and more goods were produced for the American market. Deng officially retired in 1987, but remained highly influential until he died in 1997. And 1997 would be when Hong Kong reverted back to Chinese control, and the Hong Kong citizenry retained the British customs of free speech and assembly, hence why they were one country, two systems. Now, even though he was technically out of power, the biggest stain on Deng Xiaoping's legacy would be the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, when university students celebrated the May 4th movement, and they demanded political change to match the new economic modernization efforts that they were seeing. Some moderates wanted a softer approach to dealing with the students, but Deng remembered the student actions of the Cultural Revolution, and he simply wants to nip it in the bud. He also saw how the policy of glasnost was allowing the Soviet Union to crumble. So the tanks rolled in, and thousands were killed and arrested. This is one of the most famous images of the second half of the 20th century. There were still huge gaps between rich and poor, but it's clear that China was becoming a global force that had to be reckoned with.